Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a very special guest, a good friend of mine. We met online years ago in a very intense debate on ancient history. We've been friends ever since. I'm excited to have him on this show. He is all the way from Canada. His name is Adam Myrie. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
For those of you who don't know, Adam is a representative of an awesome historical group known as HAMAA, and that is the Historical African Martial Arts Association. And so, for those of my subscribers who aren't going to know you like I do, would you do us a favor and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, as you all know, my name is Adam Myrie. I am the Chief Operations Officer of the Historical African Martial Arts Association. For those of you unfamiliar with HAMAA's work, we have a twofold mandate. The first is to study and share the information regarding Africa's military history. This goes all the way from antiquity up until World War II, which is essentially sort of the end of the traditional African warrior in the battlefield. And we also research, reconstruct, and teach the martial traditions of the various parts of Africa and its diaspora, going from north, south, east, west, central, the Americas, as well as parts of the Middle East. So this is generally the scope of what we cover. We have documentaries, workshops, classes. We do have some free classes on our YouTube channel. And we try to do as much as we can to provide as much information as we can. We have an online community that consists of about 4,000 people, a little bit more than that now. And that includes practitioners, traditional masters, researchers, blacksmiths, historians, enthusiasts, people from every corner of the world that is interested in Africa's martial arts and military history.
So definitely, before you forget, check out the links in the video description below, and you're going to really have a great time. I can't recommend it enough. Today, we're bringing you a very special and controversial subject. And that is the subject of race and ethnicity in not just the ancient world, but in ancient Egypt. We're going to be approaching this from a variety of standpoints, including archaeology, primary sources, hypotheses, and so very much more. I hope you enjoy this. And also, don't forget to check out the links in the video description below, because we will be citing you a variety of references so you can check this out for yourself. Thank you all so much, and enjoy. And so, before we jump into this, I think it's very important to talk about the variety of different hypotheses that there are involving who people have speculated the ancient Egyptians came from. I'm going to go through two of the more laughable versions, and Adam is going to take us through a couple of the others. The first hypothesis, one that is heavily rejected by modern scholarship and has been for a very long time, is the Tyranid race hypothesis, that basically the origins of the ancient Egyptians is linked to the Tatars. There's no proof for this. Academia rejects this, has rejected this, and so we're going to move on to another one, which is kind of a personal favorite of mine, even though I don't believe it at all. It's heavily debunked, but it's still funny, and that is the dynastic race theory. And basically, that an army from ancient Mesopotamia, so let's say Sumerian, for example, invades ancient Egypt and sets up the foundation for the civilization that we know of today. Now, one of the foundational stones for this hypothesis involves Sumerian cylinder seals that were found in ancient Egypt. Now, academia agrees that this was misconstrued, and so realistically, due to trade, those cylinder seals could have found their way into Egypt, or the Egyptians could have simply replicated them on their own. We know that contact in the ancient world was much more extensive than we originally thought it was. I think it's important to remember that ancient civilizations can influence each other. But realistically, there is not a Mesopotamian origin when it comes to ancient Egyptian civilization. And now, our friend Adam is going to hit the Hemetic hypothesis. Adam, would you explain to our subscribers today, what is the Hemetic hypothesis?
So the Hemetic hypothesis is what I believe has formed sort of the bedrock of our modern approach, at least in the Western world, for studying race and ethnicity in ancient Egypt. And this is what I mean. In the late 18th and early 19th century, interest in ancient Egyptian culture exploded. Now, we have to remember that this was at a time when European colonialism, imperialism was spreading around the world. And, we have unfortunate institutions like the transatlantic and the trans-Saharan slave trades, which by this time were very ethnic-based or ethnic-focused. And so you have a situation where in Africa, where you have all of these people of color, black and brown, there are the remnants of this fantastic civilization. And the further back you go, looking at the historical record, past the Ptolemies, past the Romans, past the Assyrians, you start to see more and more people of darker skin tones being depicted. You start to see the physical features change a little bit. And so they had to come up with a reason for this society to exist, but also divorce the Africans that they believed were inferior from it. And so this is where you have the Hemetic hypothesis, which is the idea of, to keep it simple, we're talking about white people who are actually dark-skinned that built the civilization. So that's why you see all of these dark-skinned people who built civilization. They're really white people who moved to Africa, got dark, and built a civilization. And the black people that are there were only there because they were enslaved. We're not even talking about the Medjay, the Nubian mercenaries, various Nubians that existed in all facets of Egyptian life. All of them, according to the Hemetic hypothesis, only existed there because they were slaves. It also serves to minimize the presence of what we in the West would call black people in ancient Egypt by saying that they only had a very tiny, small population that had very little influence or very little interaction, despite the actual historical record. So that is the Hemetic hypothesis in a nutshell. And I should probably also note that the Hemetic hypothesis is based on the biblical idea of the divisions of the race of man, Ham specifically being one of the sons of Noah, who was cursed with being black because of his sins, and therefore that is how they determined that they're calling this group of people Hamites. So that's a nice way of saying black people didn't build it.
The next one is the Asiatic race theory, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because really it does play in to the Hemetic hypothesis, and basically it's just another attempt to de-Africanize the Egyptian civilization. And so we're going to move on to the next one, which is probably just as large as the Hemetic hypothesis, and that is the Black Egyptian hypothesis. And before moving on to let Adam take it from here, I'm going to interject my thoughts on this. Many of you know that I do my best on the YouTube channel to make sure African history gets the attention that it deserves. And I have always held the standpoint that ancient Egypt is a multiracial and multicultural civilization. I feel like this is what has made it great. And I think that's one thing I love about it. And so I'm going to go ahead and say, I personally don't believe ancient Egypt was solely a black civilization. And I have a variety of reasons for thinking that. But I'm going to let Adam actually walk us through this series or this hypothesis and give us his thoughts and really set the record straight. Adam, I'm going to go ahead and let you take it from here.
Thanks, Nick. When we're talking about the Black Egyptian hypothesis, we have to understand that it is a reaction to the Hemetic hypothesis. You have to understand that when we look at the context of, because again, this is a Western point of view, when we look at the way that African history is taught and treated in the Western world, under the influence of the transatlantic slave trade and all of the racial caste system baggage that came with it, there was a lot of untruth told. So you have situations where, especially in the 20th century, Black Americans, Black Canadians, Black people in the West can now afford to travel to Egypt and Africa and actually see these places. And what we see in the statues is our own faces. So now the question becomes, well, what is the truth? They lied to us. Because usually when we look at depictions of Egyptians, especially in Hollywood, we have the focus on Cleopatra, we have the gods of Egypt, we have nearly every production, aside from The Prince of Egypt, which is one of my favorite films. Egyptians are generally portrayed as Europeans or very near to European. But on the ground in Egypt, you go to Luxor, you go to, Aswan, you go to Upper Egypt. That's not necessarily what is the truth for who is actually in Egypt. So the Black Egyptian hypothesis is essentially a rejection of the Hemetic hypothesis, arguing that whether for the right or whether for the wrong, Egypt was a Black civilization. We can look at the origins of Egypt and then have that debate and have that discussion. But I think it's very important to note that this is largely the African diaspora saying, hey, Western education has lied to us about Egypt and Africa's origins and our place in the world, arguing that we have no history. And so this is essentially the response to that. The idea that, well, you're saying Egypt was not Black, or you're saying Egypt was all white or made by these dark-skinned Hamites, and our argument is those Hamites are Black, because if they were around today, then those same Egyptians would be sitting at the back of the bus with the rest of us. That's essentially the Black Egyptian hypothesis in a nutshell.
And now we're going to jump straight to it, and we're going to hit DNA. But before we talk about ancient DNA methods and the misuse of that information, I want to quote a little bit of an article by archaeologist John Terrell. This article is titled Plug and Play Genetics, Racial Migrations, and Human History. A surprising number of geneticists, anthropologists, archaeologists, linguists, and other academics nowadays still seem willing to accept the old-fashioned folk idea that people belong to more or less separate and distinct collective kinds that can be labeled as populations. These are also sometimes called groups, peoples, tribes, and the like. Once upon a time, these supposed collectives would have been called races, at least in some contexts. Many of us know nowadays, of course, that we need to avoid using this word for politically correct reasons, if for none other. Hence, almost nobody nowadays, for example, would write about Polynesian speakers in the Central or Eastern Pacific as a race. Instead, they are usually referred to as a population. This may sound better, but the author notes, let's be honest, distinguishing between races and populations is effectively making a distinction without a difference. If this comes across as sounding crazy to you, then tell me this. What is a population? How can you tell whether you are inside a population or outside it? How many of them are there out there in the real world? How many did there used to be? More than today or fewer? Now substitute in these simple questions the word race. Doesn't make much difference, right? While common sense, not to mention racial prejudice, may lead us to believe we are a wildly diverse animal species, science now knows that regardless of how wonderful and unique you may think yourself to be, you are on average 99.9% identical, genetically speaking, to every other person on Earth. So wow, the author says, we are all really, really biologically the same under our skins. This is not just a politically correct slogan. It's science. And so, now that we come to a subject, which is DNA, many of us who have been online have seen the use and abuse of DNA testing. And Adam, I'm going to let you take it from here on this.
Sure. So let me preface this by saying I am not a geneticist. but I do love to read studies. And some of the things that I like to pick apart are methodologies and what are the limitations of the study. So sometimes it's very important to make sure you understand how a study was conducted and how the results are being reported. Um, I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I think it was maybe 4 years ago, around the time you and I met, there was a study that came out that was published or reported on, I should say, in I think it was Nature magazine or Nature.com, and the title of it was "Egypt may be African, but its pharaohs." Now, that's obviously a really sexy title, right? You really want to find out, okay, well, what does that mean? Who wrote this? How does it come together? And all of this. And then you read the study. And what ended up happening is the internet exploded. History pages, and I use the term loosely, many of these were white supremacists, in leaning at least, often spoke on, whoa, well, you see, Egypt is not African, their pharaohs weren't African, this clearly was built this way. Look, here's the DNA test to prove it. They only came up here because of slavery, etc. So this is what was floating around in the air. Problem. That particular study had more than a few limitations. And I like to use limitations because I don't want to say errors, because they wrote on what those limitations were in the study. One of the issues was that they only tested mummies from not Upper Egypt, sorry, from Lower Egypt. So this is the Delta. That is a genetically distinct population from Upper Egypt. Remembering, of course, that Egypt is the combination of two different groups to make one kingdom. And we're going to be talking about that later, but essentially we're talking about people who would have filtered in, say, 5,000 some odd years ago from the Levant and the Middle East during the, I guess, was it the Neolithic backflow? I can't remember what it's called, but there was a time when a bunch of people from the Middle East and the Levant basically flowed back into Africa and mixed with the local population. Another issue was that they only tested mummies after, I believe it was the Middle Kingdom, or the New Kingdom. It was something around 1300 years ago. Now, what's important about that is that was after the last indigenous dynasty that ruled Egypt. That doesn't include the pre-dynastic period, and that doesn't include some periods of the Old Kingdom. So what you end up getting is a situation where you're testing the genetics of a population after its entire elite class has been removed in the northern part of Egypt, where they are more closely tied to populations outside of Egypt. So what you end up getting when you do that study is you think, oh, well, clearly they can't be Egyptian. But that's similar to studying all of the presidents of the United States of America over the last 250 years, and then saying, well, you see, Native Americans are all European. That doesn't make sense, because you are testing people who are from a different population after a different time period. And this is after the entire elite class has been replaced. And they do talk about it in the study. Even mentioned that for some people, it's difficult to pin down their ethnicity because during the Ptolemaic and during the Roman period, they took Greek and Latin names. So that is something else to consider. Another issue that we have is that when we're looking at the populations, when they tested to see whether or not they were related to sub-Saharan Africa, there are two major issues with that. The first major issue is that, if I remember correctly, they were testing people from Central Africa who have no relationship to Egypt. They don't. They're from a separate population. That's almost like testing Russians to find out whether or not the people who currently live in England are really British. That doesn't make sense. You're testing two separate populations for that. The other issue is that they didn't look into testing people from Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. So the Cushitic peoples who would have more consistently interacted with the people of Upper and Lower Egypt. So what you end up getting is a study that is heavily biased, that says, well, look, we tested this small group of elites from a ethnic group that was, that came in and took over the population, and this is our litmus test for who is not Egyptian. They also talk about slavery, which is a thing that happened in ancient Egypt. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. And I'm not going to pretend that slavery during the Arab conquest or the Islamic conquest didn't happen either. So yes, you do have an influx of Central African or Bantu, I'll say, DNA flowing up in there due to the movement of people through the slave trade. But that is not the quote unquote black population that was there and that's been there from antiquity. And so that is something that's important to note. I mean, recently, actually, there was a study also published in Nature that talks about how Copts, who are viewed as the primary group of the indigenous Egyptian, I personally believe that there were two indigenous groups in Egypt, the Copts and the Upper Egyptian. Copts representing the marriage of northern and southern Egyptians, and then Upper Egyptians being Upper Egyptian population, showing that they actually have ancestral relationships to Southwest Sudan and sharing ancestors with the Beja, with various ethnic groups of Ethiopians, like the Habesha, and with Nubians, who basically have been in Egypt since Egypt was Egypt. There was also an mtDNA study that was published in Science Direct that talks about how little variance there was between Egypt, Nubia, and Sudan, implying a common ancestry, but also mentioning that, which is really interesting, that as you go further south, you see more genetic diversity in the mitochondrial DNA, implying that there was a particular area in the Nile Valley from which people had spread out into the south and into the north, into the various directions, because you have, in one area, you have little genetic diversity or fewer genetic diversity or less genetic diversity, I should say. And then as you spread out, you start to see that expand. But you still see that these groups are all related. So these are important things to think about when we talk about DNA. Not to mention that when we look at mitochondrial DNA, you are testing one genetic marker that follows through one maternal family line that leads to one specific ancestor. So this leaves out fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. So somebody might have mitochondrial DNA that goes back to a specific population, say in Assyria, but almost all of their male ancestors might be local Egyptian. So you can get a DNA test that says this person is originally from Babylon, but every person in their family since that one female ancestor was Egyptian. So these are things that we have to consider when looking at these tests. This is not to say that they're not reliable. We just have to be careful with how we read them to make sure that we're properly understanding what is told to us and what the limitations of those studies are.
And to sum up the DNA portion of our talk, I want to talk about another article by archaeologist Michael Press, and that is who's responsible for bad reporting on mummies. Michael Press pointed out, if we listen to scholars, we often hear that the sensationalism and factual errors in popular understanding of history are the fault of the media. They suggest that journalists distort the findings of scholarship or aren't interested in ethical issues. Yet, in the cases of the two recent mummy announcements, as in many others, we see that these problems start with the scholarship itself. Mummies, it seems, are always in the news. Just days after a British team claimed somewhat dubiously that they had synthesized the voice of a 3,000-year-old mummy of the priest Neseyaman, a second group of British researchers announced their own study about a 26-year-old mummy of a woman named Takabuti in the Ulster Museum. Like the earlier study, this announcement made news headlines around the world. Using CT scans and DNA analysis, the researchers made a number of new findings about Takabuti's life. They found that she had an extra tooth, for instance, experienced a violent death such as being stabbed in the back, and mummification. The news stories also announced that her DNA suggested her ancestry was closer to modern Europeans than Arabs. This last finding stands out for many reasons. For one, when we look at the details of the claim, it begins to fall apart. The geneticist involved in the study refers to the mummy's genetic footprint, H4A1, a reference to a specific mitochondrial DNA, ancestry, or haplogroup. Yet, this DNA represents just a single ancestral lineage, a single data point among all of the tens of thousands for any individual. This is just one example of how we can draw incorrect and incomplete conclusions from these findings. For instance, take any person living today and trace their ancestry back 500 years. They would have had tens, if not hundreds of thousands of ancestors living at that time. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, if successful, will identify the genes of just one of those tens of thousands of people. It is a huge leap to move from a single lineage to broad conclusions about ancestry being European or Arab, especially when these terms are used as monolithic ancestral groups, failing to take into account movements of individuals and groups throughout the last few thousand years, if not longer. That is not the only problem. Proving the European ancestry of ancient Egyptians, particularly, he explains, of Egyptian royalty, has been a running goal of research on mummies for over 200 years. A century or two ago, it was determined by measuring skulls and comparing physical features. Now it is done through ancient DNA testing. Throughout all of this, the methods have been scientifically questionable. Problems with DNA studies are legion, he explains, with small sample sizes, broad claims made from individual data points, and, not surprisingly, contradictory results. The failures of past race science should give researchers pause in the present to consider that our current assumptions might also be flawed and troubled. The author goes on to say that if we listen to scholars, we often hear that the sensationalism and factual errors in popular understanding of history are the fault of the media. They suggest that journalists distort the findings of scholarship or that they aren't interested in ethical issues. Yet, as he explains, in the cases of the two recent mummy announcements, as in many others, we see that these problems start with the scholarship itself. The Takabuti study, for example, that Michael is focusing on, goes on to say that this study, while adding to our knowledge of an ancient Egyptian, involved questionable race science. And I will go a step forward and say, as he did, that scholars, publicists, journalists, all collaborate, even if unintentionally, in providing poor understandings of the past and how we present it to the public. These examples also raise, as he ends his article, another troubling question. Do scholars tailor their work to get media attention? This wouldn't exactly be surprising given the temptations for publicity and funding, but it would be a major problem, especially when it comes to the integrity of history. Scholars should publicize issues like ethics because they are important and shape our understanding of how we use the past. This shouldn't depend on whether the media cares or not. When we fail to discuss these issues, we teach readers and viewers that news stories about mummies are supposed to be lurid and merely sensationalist. When it comes to ethics, we tell the public not to care. And now we're approaching the origins of the Egyptians themselves, and these are the variety of peoples that will come to define one of the greatest civilizations in our history. And that is, where did they come from? Who were they? What did they evolve into? When it comes to the world of pre-dynastic Egypt, we have a large history. We have a variety of peoples moving across the world, and not just in North Africa, but across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. When it comes to North Africa, it has a similar history, and that is a variety of peoples moving in, out, back again, and intermingling with their neighbors.
So here is one of the first things we need to understand about Nile Valley culture. The idea that it was not created by what we would identify as Black people, which is a conversation unto itself, kind of falls apart when you consider the fact that Nile Valley culture goes back to about 5,000 or 6,000. We're talking 8,000 years ago, probably a little bit longer. People who have been identified as having white skin did not exist until about 10,000 years ago. So at the time that white people, as we will identify them for the course of ease of discourse, I should say, actually existed as a separate group of people, in the western part of Asia, or northwestern part of Asia, we already have an entire civilization producing art, pottery, with permanent dwellings, living in the Nile Valley at that time. We fast forward a little bit, and we get that Neolithic backflow at 3,000 some odd BCE. So there's already, and at that time, the Tuscany culture, as we would call that now, was vibrant and had rulers and culture and was producing art that we still haven't quite figured out yet. And these are all people who are genetically connected to the peoples of northern Sudan, Nubia, their Cushitic cousins, I should say. Then we go on to the unification of Egypt. Narmer was the king of Upper Egypt, who moved north to conquer Lower Egypt. So the idea that we are separating sort of the Africanness out of the founding of Egypt just doesn't wash when you look at the historical record.
And to follow up on this and pre-dynastic Egyptian culture, I want to quote the work of Dr. Maria Gatto, who has suggested that the makers of the pre-dynastic Egyptian Naqada culture centered, for example, in Upper Egypt, and that is the south of Egypt, shared an almost identical culture with the A-group peoples of Lower Nubia, south of Mount Silsila. Sites of the culturally similar Nubian A group are found as far as the Second Cataract of the Nile and beyond. These have a long span continuing as late as the Egyptian early dynastic period. Keep in mind, we know that there have been populations moving into North Africa from the Levant. No one's denying that peoples from what is now the Middle East moved into Egypt. But we are focusing on the more, at this point, indigenous populations of the Nile. And I think information like this is very vital in understanding the origins of Egyptian civilization. And I'm going to go a little bit farther and tell you a little bit more about what Dr. Christina Riggs of the University of East Anglia and John Baines of Oxford University wrote. And that is, as developed in the fields of anthropology and sociology, the concept of ethnicity offers one possible approach to analyzing diversity in the population of ancient Egypt. However, it is important that ethnicity not be equated with foreignness. As has often been the case, Egyptological literature. Ethnicity is a social construct based on self-image, and thus may be difficult to identify in the ancient sources, where a monolithic uniformity of Egyptian versus other prevails. A range of sources does suggest that ethnic difference operated within the indigenous population throughout Egyptian history, as would be expected in any complex society. Dr. Riggs follows up and points out that in the Middle Kingdom, for example, circa 2030 to 1640 BCE, I said BCE instead of BC. Don't hate me. And Second Intermediate Period, the distinctive burials and pottery assemblages of the Nubian C group, Pangrave, and Kerma cultures appear in cemeteries throughout Egypt.
So, Nick, to dovetail to your original point, one thing we have to mention as well is that 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was wet. You have to remember that compared to what it was now, it was not the impassable barrier that people often describe it as. And even now, um, even before we had automobiles, it was not an impassable barrier because you had nomads traveling north and south and back and forth through the Sahara for trade. So as the Sahara dried out, more people who lived in the area that is described as the Sahara, some moved west to West Africa, some moved east to Egypt, some moved north up closer to the Mediterranean, and everybody just had to find a place to go when things started to dry out. And you see all of the paintings and the artifacts they find throughout the Sahara, where they go and see these life scenes from 100,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. Remembering as well that Nile Valley culture is at least 3,000 years older than the Sahara drying out. So we're going to see a lot of overlap. Egypt itself was a crossroad. People moved to the Nile, escaping the environmental pressures that they were forced to deal with. In the Middle East, they had I really wish I remembered what the driver of the backflow in was. I think it was a drought, but you'll have to double check that on me because I don't quite remember the specific environmental pressure. But there was an environmental cause for that backflow, and then you also have the drying out of the Sahara, which forced people to move into the Nile Valley and forced some people north because they couldn't necessarily just occupy land that was already inhabited by other people. So this is where we start to see that difference. So I really think that it is very important for us to remember that piece of information as well.
And so people may ask as you're watching this video, what are you trying to say? Why were you talking about the Nubians and burials being all over Egypt? And this is my point here. My point is I've seen way too many arguments online that try to say that, one, there are no Black Egyptians, and two, that peoples from the South couldn't have possibly made their way to, let's say, Lower Egypt. And I find that preposterous. I think that is pushed by people who don't understand how travel in the ancient world works and the interconnectedness of the ancient world in general. And so I'm going to follow this up by talking about ethnicity in Pharonic Egypt. And actually, I'm going to be quoting Dr. Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia and his article that is titled Coping with Ethnicity in Pharonic Egypt. Dr. Garcia starts his article by asking, did ancient Egyptians care about ethnicity? Judging from the abundant texts and representations that we have, it seems that ethnicity did matter and that they did have some thoughts on the subject. Processions of foreigners carrying their tribute to the sovereign of Egypt stand out from their colorful characters dressed in distinctive non-Egyptian clothes and wearing unequivocal markers of their ethnic origins. But the almost folkloric features they display in these representations conceal the fact that foreigners were often full members of Egyptian society, well integrated and fulfilling trades and activities, even high-ranking offices, indistinguishable from their Egyptian fellow. In fact, were it not by their occasional description as Amu or Nahisi or Liu, those terms being Asiatic, Nubian, and Libyan, in their own monuments, nothing in their looks, titles, names, or cultural markers would reveal any particular ethnic identity. From an ideological point of view, the Pharonic culture set clear distinction between Egypt and foreign territories, including their respective lifestyles, values, and beliefs. According to the ideal of Maat, the cosmic order, Pharaoh had the duty to fight and defeat foreigners, represented as the 9 bows which menaced the borders of Egypt, eager to invade and plunder its wealth at the very least opportunity. However, Things were not so simple in reality. Egypt was far from being the exclusive abode of high culture, the doctor notes. Social order and economic prosperity that Pharonic services were so inclined to boast about, the model to be imitated. In fact, when regional rulers emerged in periods of political division, they frequently considered more favorable to invoke not a prestigious Egyptian royal ancestry, but a foreign one. Hyksos kings defining themselves not necessarily as pharaohs, but as rulers of foreign lands, or regional princes calling themselves Libyans, show in the end that ethnicity is always a cultural construct, an identity marker devoid of any national or biological essentialism, fixed once and forever, open therefore to continuous reinterpretation and re-elaboration. Dr. Garcia points out, for example, a Nubian prince known as Meherpri, educated in Egypt with the royal children and buried in the Valley of the Kings. In his Book of the Dead, this man was represented as an Egyptian, and only his curly hair reveals that he was a Nubian. The doctor also notes Hequanifer, an official of Tutankhamun who is buried at Toshka in Nubia. He was depicted as an Egyptian in his tomb, but as a dark-skinned Nubian in the tomb of his superior, the viceroy of Kush Amenhotep Hoi. Finally, he points out the last example of his article, Horimen, a general of the army in the palace of the king, who lived in the late Ramesside period, who represented in his tomb, known as TT221, wearing perfectly a Egyptian dress and ornaments. Only his depiction in one scene, bearing a beard and a feather, suggests that he was quite possibly of Libyan origins. When considered in a broad perspective, it appears that things hardly could have been different. Egypt was placed at a strategic geographical crossroads between Africa, the Near East, between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Commercial exchanges, flows of goods and ideas, diffusion of techniques and contacts between different peoples, Dr. Garcia notes, favored the presence of foreign populations in the Nile Valley, where they left a durable influence. It may be significant that the lived experiences of cultural heroes such as Sinuhe, the eloquent peasant, or even Winnamoon, who took place in the exotic, foreign, and or marginal settings. In other cases, Dr. Garcia notes, it was foreign fashion, literary motifs, military expertise, or simply managerial skill that were easily integrated into Egyptian culture and society, thus challenging, as he notes, these monolithic views about contact with inferior peoples and territories so prevalent in official culture. This is particularly clear in the case of multicultural communities which existed precisely to achieve particular goals in which the collaboration and coexistence of different peoples was indispensable for the crown. To follow this up, now that I've given you this long synopsis from Dr. Garcia, I have an ancient Egyptian story I want to tell, reported to us by the father of history, also the father who is sometimes lied to, as I like to say. And it's an account from an ancient Egyptian oracle. The 5th century BC writer Herodotus records a legal dispute that provides one definition of Egyptian identity. A community on the western delta fringes argued that it shouldn't have to pay taxes because it was outside of Egypt. But the oracle consulted in the case gave the answer that all who drank of the Nile north of the Elephantine were Egyptians. Why is this important? That would imply that a variety of peoples of different ethnicities, and yes, according to our perception in the modern world, of different races, were considered to be Egyptians.
So going back to dovetail again to the point that you've made, uh, we are talking about a kingdom or an empire that was founded by the unification of two disparate peoples. And that is, again, something that is important to note. Not to mention that Egyptian territory also included the Sinai and parts of the Levant at different periods and certain parts of Libya. And the fact that the Garamantes were sometimes brought in as, mercenaries or sometimes moved in and settled in Egypt. I like to say this about empires. The moment that you become an empire is when you have to give up the idea of having a singular culture or ethnicity. Because the very idea of having an empire is bringing different groups of people together for a singular national purpose. So if you, as mentioned in the quote that you brought up, or the quote that you just read from, if these people are drinking from the Nile and they're from this land, then they are Egyptians. They may be Egyptians of a particular subgroup, but they will be referred to as Egyptians. It's almost like becoming an American or becoming a Canadian or becoming any group of people from a country where you have all of these different ethnic groups that come together. I mean, at the end of the day, you may be African American or Native American or European American or Asian American, but you are still an American. Same thing in Canada. You could come from China, you could come from India, you could come from Bangladesh, you could come from Mongolia, you could come from Libya, but you become a Canadian by moving here, speaking the language, adopting aspects of the culture. Back then, it was adopting the language, culture, fashion, and religion. If you had the language, fashion, culture, and religion, you were Egyptian. It didn't really matter what subgroup you were from.
And so now we come to a fun, misconstrued, and often misrepresented topic in ancient Egyptian history, and that is the subject of art. Many of us are familiar with intense debates raging online in which people share pictures with no context whatsoever, because in their mind, because I've shown this, it proves my point. I'm going to show an image now. It is very well known, and it is Egyptian taskmasters counting their often called Nubian slaves to show, and many people, especially Europeans, will use this as a way to say, see, there's a huge difference between those people and who I'm calling Egyptian. Well, it's not that simple, and I'm going to show you this picture. I'm referencing a Nubian mercenary buried at Gibelline, which is south of Luxor, and this is from the late 3rd millennium BCE. As you can see, and will see with this illustration, he is depicted, for example, with red skin rather than black skin, and we know for a fact he was a Nubian. Like I've always said, it's not as simple as black and red. When it comes to Egyptian art, I'm going to quote portions of an article written by an upcoming guest, an academic, Intoki. She points out in her work on ancient Egyptian identity that it is important to distinguish between color symbolism and color prejudice. An analysis of ancient Egyptian art, she points out, and statuary shows that color symbolism does not always lead to color prejudice, or for that matter, ethnic prejudice. She also goes on to discuss the fact that ancient Egyptians had religious color symbolism, which leads to calls for a cautionary note in utilizing Egyptian reliefs and paintings to assess ethnicity and racial characteristics. Certain scholars propose, she notes, that the color symbolism was related to the ancient Egyptian religious conceptualization of the cycle of life and death. The paint consisted of red, ochre, and oxide of iron and vegetable gum binder. The paint probably signified the blood of life encompassed in the male, and the yellow color that we often see represented fertility encompassed in the female. The ancient Egyptian society was patriarchal, and the economy was based primarily on agricultural fertility. This suggestion from certain academics, these implications of color symbolism may actually hold ground. Furthermore, the goddess Hathor, who is believed to give birth to the yellow sun every day, was considered the patroness of women. She makes this point because throughout Egyptian art, we often see men portrayed typically as just red, and women portrayed sometimes as white, sometimes as yellow. And she points that out to make sure that we don't automatically just generalize entire populations of people based on certain reliefs. There's always going to be a propaganda in the art. That's the whole point. That's always been the point. For us, the harder task is figuring out what the real story is. And I'm saying all of this to say, just because you find a picture that you think fits your narrative doesn't mean it's actually meaning what you want it to say.
Yeah, so to add on to that, I'm really glad that you mentioned this because you actually do see this trend in Egyptian art, especially in art that depicts people of a particular social class and art that depicts things that have to do with religion. Mind you, if you look at depictions of the common folk, you'll find the common folk are generally male and female done in the same colors. There's a famous image of two naked women dancing at a festival, and they're both painted brown. Then we also have to consider the fact that Egyptians painted foreigners different colors as well. So when they painted people from the Levant, they painted them white skin. But when you look at some of the art of the people of the Levant, their skin wasn't that white. You have the depictions, for example, that the Minoans and some of the Phoenicians did of themselves, and they painted themselves as brown people. Whether how brown, what your scale or sort of, I'll say, bar for brownness may vary, but they were definitely people who had some time in the sun. So that's something that's also important to note. You see this in other art in other cultures as well. If we fast forward to medieval Europe and the depiction of the Moors living in Iberia, you'll find that European depictions of Moors often depict them as black-skinned people. And when you actually look at who the Moors were, you look at, for example, there's a book called Cantigas. I forget what the number is. I think it's 13, written in Spain. I think it's the 1300s. You see Moors who are depicted with red beards and white skin. But when you look at any of Shakespeare's plays, when he talks about Moors, they're all black people. So that is something to consider, that when a group of people wants to otherize a foreign group, they're going to exaggerate things about them. We did the same thing in World War II when we talked about the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians. We had all of this crazy propaganda art that we put out in the 1940s. If that was the only art that anyone had ever seen us make of people living in Japan and Italy and Germany, they would think that that's what they look like. That's what we're doing when we look at Egyptian art, and assume that their depictions of people with exaggerated features are representative of what that looks like. Knowing the history of Egypt, knowing that it was initially a dark-skinned population, and knowing that they do have a tendency to exaggerate the appearance of people they see as foreign, so that they can make a clear distinction between people who act like this are Egyptian, people who act like this are Kushites, people who act like this are Mitanni, etc., so on and so forth.
And a lot of this comes to a very fine conclusion, and that is history isn't black and white. It never was. It's never that simple. If it's being explained to you as that simple, realistically, it is being pushed by a fictitious narrative that will never accurately paint the correct picture of the past. On a subject such as ancient Egypt, when we ask ourselves, who were the ancient Egyptians? Where did they come from? The truth is, they came from a variety of places, and some of them, for as long as they could remember, had always been there. We're talking indigenous populations who had been along the Nile for as long as time can tell, along with populations who came from the Sudan, the Sahara, the Levant, otherwise known to many of you as Canaan. All of these peoples over different times came in, they settled, they connected. In many cases, these populations mixed, forming different cultures based off of the older ones. And all of these different peoples and cultures ends up coming together through a variety of processes and eventually unification to create one of the greatest civilizations that will ever exist in our history. And it was this diversity that made it great, because everyone brought something to the table, whether it be religious customs, to military activities, policing, you name it, art, trade. They all played a vital role in Egyptian society. Everyone, to an extent, was a stakeholder in one of the greatest civilizations that has ever existed. And so I've said all of that to say this. In modern attempts to whitewash, or not even necessarily whitewash, but ignore the Black history of North Africa, of Egypt, in an attempt to, in many ways, give credit to foreigners who eventually settled in and became a part of what's going to be known as civilization, such as groups from Canaan. I want to say this now, and that is, we know through art, archaeology, and early studies of our history that yes, there were Black people not only in North Africa, but there were Black Egyptians. This shouldn't be a surprise. This shouldn't be a shock. The proof is there in the archaeology, in the art, in primary sources. Egyptians didn't view color the way we did. They weren't colorblind, but it didn't matter. What did matter was their views on Egyptianness. Now, I will say, obviously, there are Black Egyptians, but I want to take it a step farther and say that realistically, without a doubt, Black Africans provided the foundational culture, the original cultures that will eventually merge along with later cultures to form what we know as Egyptian civilization. And Adam, I want you to take it from here, clarify, and add your point on this as well.
Sure. I'd like to just give a few examples. I think that much of what we have studied historically about Egypt has been heavily focused on Egypt's relationship to the Mediterranean, and not enough of it has been focused to Egypt's relationship basically south of Nubia. So there are a few great examples. One of my favorites are the Egyptian headrests. So if you ever see them, and I don't know, Nick, if you can put a picture of one up, but it's a little flat thing. It's got a little curve on the top of it, and it was used for sleeping. So there's a meme floating around talking about how it was used for people to protect their hair at night. It wasn't, mostly because Egyptians were known for shaving themselves because lice was a big problem. But this was basically their version of a pillow. Interestingly enough, you see that almost an exact same design among the Maasai in Kenya. You see it in traditional villages in Ethiopia. You see versions in Somalia. You see that same little headdress design with slight cultural variations all throughout sort of that sphere of cultural influence and trade. You also have other examples like jejet. So that's the popular Egyptian harp. Well, there are two types. There was the harp and the lute. So the lute that is actually wrapped onto the wrist and played sort of like this, they still play that in Sudan today. There's a lot of popular music and poetry in Sudan and along the Nile, where that instrument is still played. You see it featured heavily in Egyptian art. Another example, as I mentioned earlier, was jejet, which in Uganda is called the adungu or udungu. And that is still played today. And it's actually quite good. You should YouTube it. It's a wonderful instrument. But that instrument is still played today. It looks slightly different because of the cultural influences in the ornamentation of the instrument. But same number of strings, same configuration for the bass, same configuration for the neck, and the sound is not that different. So, we have examples such as that. You look at the way that grain was ground in ancient Egypt with that round sort of base and that sort of pestle item that was ground two-handed. That is still done in parts of Africa that are around the Sahel and in East Africa. So these are just some examples. And some of the bigger examples as well are the martial traditions. The wrestling that you see on the walls of Beni Hassan, that you see at the Ablution Acropolis, that style of wrestling still exists throughout the continent. It is still done in Sudan. Versions of it are done in West Africa. Versions of it are done in Central Africa. There are tournaments and competitions using the same techniques that you see on those walls. So to say that Egypt, at its founding and its connection and its relationships, was not African is just not correct, because too much of its legacy exists in Africa. We can debate as to whether or not those cultural items move north into Egypt or move south out of Egypt. But the fact of the matter is, these are uniquely African cultural expressions that you don't see elsewhere.
And to my subscribers, again, check out the links in the video description below. It's not only going to take you to awesome sites to where you can join and be a part of the awesome HAMAA community online and learn a variety of wonderful things from these great people and their mission in spreading history, the knowledge of it, and making history matter. But you'll also see a variety of references and links to things such as scientific journals, the articles I have cited and referenced throughout this, that will help you better understand what the actual experts have to say about race and ethnicity in ancient Egypt. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
And ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful night.